By sundown, Mercy Ben would say Ruth Bell had finally lost what little sense God gave her. They would say a woman with a burned cheek, a dry goods shop, and no husband had no business unlatching her door for the wild man from the high ridges. But that morning, when sleet scratched at the windows like fingernails, a man as broad as a doorframe shouldered his way into her store with a steel wolf trap in one hand and blood freezing black along his sleeve. Ruth did not scream. She only looked at the trap, then at the man holding it, and said, "If that thing bites my floorboards, you pay for the gouge." The man stopped. For one long second, the whole shop seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the wind dragged loose snow through the street. Inside, dust floated over the counter, over the flour sacks, over Ruth's ledger with its narrow columns of debt and survival. The stranger's beard was packed with frost. His coat was sewn from elk hide and canvas patches, dark at the cuffs, stiff with weather. He smelled of cold iron, spruce smoke, and something raw from beyond the timberline. Most men in Mercy Bend smelled of tobacco and pomade and old fear they called manners. This man smelled like he had never asked the town for permission to exist. He lowered the trap carefully, not on the floor, on the counter. Ruth noticed that first. His hands were enormous, cracked at the knuckles, with dried blood in the creases, yet he set the trap down as gently as a churchwoman setting down a teacup. "Needs salt." His voice sounded unused, as if words were tools he kept buried until necessary. Ruth wiped her palms on her apron. Flour whitened the heel of her hand. "Salt comes in half. Pound measures. 1 pound, or sack weight, 2 pounds. What else? Coffee. Lamp wick, blue thread." That made her look up. Blue thread? His slate, colored eyes moved from the shelves to her face. Not to the scar, to her face. The burn ran from the corner of Ruth's right jaw to just under her cheekbone. A pale, tight seam left by the barn fire that killed her father and ended every soft story Mercy Bend had ever tried to tell about her. The skin pulled when she spoke, when she smiled, which was rarely. Only one side obeyed. The town had made an education of not staring. They failed at it every day. The stranger did not fail. He simply saw it, accepted it as fact, and moved on. "Blue thread," he repeated. "Strong kind." Ruth turned before the strange pressure in her chest could show on her face. The store was narrow, dim, and packed tighter than a miser's fist. Kegs of nails by the door, beans in open bins, bolts of calico stacked beneath the west wall, lamp oil locked behind the counter, because two boys had once decided fire was a game, and Ruth had not laughed. Her life was measured in practical things. 14 sacks of flour, if the ceiling held, 6 tins of peaches nobody could afford until Sunday, $27.11 owed by people who lowered their voices when they said her name. At 29, Ruth had become part of the shop, useful, dry, necessary. Something people entered when they needed coffee or kerosene and escaped before loneliness stuck to their clothes. "Blue thread's 3 cents, she said, setting it down. The man nodded. "You got a name?" she asked. "Kade? That first or last? Only one I use." He pulled a small buckskin pouch from inside his coat and emptied a pinch of gold dust onto her scale. Real dust, heavy. More than the account required. Ruth adjusted the brass weights with 2 fingers. "This is too much. Keep the rest. I don't run a charity for mountain men who don't know arithmetic." A corner of his mouth shifted beneath the beard. Not quite a smile. Something that had forgotten how. Hold it, then. "On account?" "On account." Ruth wrote his name in the ledger. Kade. No last name. No address. No promise he would ever return. When she looked up, he had his eyes on the blue thread. He picked up the spool, turning it in his hand. The bright color looked almost foolish against his scarred palm. "Who needs mending?" she asked. He slid the spool into his pocket, something that tore. Then he gathered the salt, coffee, and wick with one arm and lifted the wolf trap with the other. At the door, he paused. The sleet behind him turned the street into a gray blur. "Bell," he said. Ruth still. "What?" He nodded toward the ledger where her own name was printed at the top of the page. Ruth Bell. She hated how it sounded in his mouth. Not cruel, not pitying, just known. "That is what the sign says," she answered. He looked at the burned side of her face, then back into her eyes. Good sign. Then he stepped into the weather, and the door shut behind him with a hard wooden clap. For the rest of the day, Ruth smelled spruce smoke where there was none. Kade came back 19 days later with a bullet crease across his ribs and a dead silence around him that made 2 customers leave without buying. It was late afternoon, the hour when winter light turns everything in a store. Honest. The shelves looked poorer. The dust looked thicker. Ruth had been counting nails into paper twists because nails could be counted, and counting was easier than remembering. Kade filled the entrance. This time there was no trap, no neat order, no measured transaction. His left hand pressed against his side, and dark blood glistened between his fingers. Ruth's stomach tightened. "You planning to drip on every plank I own?" she asked. He leaned one shoulder against the door jamb. "Wouldn't if I could help it." The words were thin. That frightened her more than the blood. "Sit." He did not move. Ruth stepped out from behind the counter. "Sit down before you fall down. I will not be dragged into gossip because a man died standing in my doorway." Kade studied her for half a breath. Then, to her surprise, he obeyed. He lowered himself onto a crate of seed barley beside the stove. The crate complained under his weight but held. Ruth locked the front door and turned the sign to close. Mercy Bend would talk. Mercy Bend always talked. She fetched hot water, carbolic, clean cloth, and the sewing basket she kept beneath the ledger. Her hands moved with a shopkeeper's efficiency. No fuss, no trembling, no soft sounds. Soft sounds invited men to be heroic. Ruth had no patience for heroics. "Coat off," she said. Kade's jaw tightened. "Or bleed inside it and ruin the hide. Your choice." That got him moving. He shrugged out of the elk, hide coat with a controlled grimace. Beneath it, his homespun shirt was stuck to his side, red, black, and stiff. Ruth cut it open with shears meant for canvas. The wound was ugly but clean. A rifle ball had grazed him, carving a hot line across the muscle and taking enough skin to make a weaker man curse. Ruth pressed the wet cloth to it. Kade sucked air through his teeth. "Bandits?" she asked. "Men. That narrows it. Men who thought a lone trapper was easier to rob than a stage. And were they correct? No." She glanced at him. For the first time, she saw something like humor deep in the exhausted gray of his eyes. The discovery unsettled her. She cleaned the wound in silence. The smell of blood mixed with carbolic and hot iron from the stove outside. Hooves passed in the slush. Inside the shop had shrunk to the distance between her hand and his breathing. Kade watched her face while she worked. Most people watched the scar by accident and then looked away by force. Kade watched as if a face was not a thing to judge, but a weather report to read. "Fire did that?" he asked. The cloth stopped moving. Ruth's voice cooled. "You ask every woman you meet how she became unpleasant to look at." "No." "Then don't start with me." He accepted the rebuke without flinching. A normal man would have apologized too much, made a performance of kindness, then glanced at the scar again before he left. Kade only lowered his gaze to the wound, as if waiting for permission to keep breathing. Ruth hated that it softened her. "Barn fire," she said at last. "I was 12. Kade nodded once. "Fire's greedy. It took what it wanted." "No," he looked back at her. "It tried." The words landed harder than they should have. Ruth threaded a needle with black silk because it was strongest, not because it was pretty. She tied the knot twice and bent close enough to feel the heat coming off him. "This will hurt." "Most things worth keeping do." "That's a foolish saying. Still true." She pushed the needle through his skin. His hand clenched on his knee, but he did not pull away. Stitch by stitch, she drew the torn edges together. Flesh became line. Line became repair. Kade stared at the stove. "Town doesn't know what to do with a woman who can stand pain," he said. Ruth's fingers paused only a moment. "They know exactly what to do," she said. "They make her useful and then punish her for not being sweet." A low sound moved through him. Not quite anger. Not quite agreement. "Up in the snow," he said. "Sweet gets buried." Ruth cut the thread. "And what survives up there?" He turned his head. "Warmth, sense, hands that work. A spine that doesn't fold." There it was again. The strange way he turned all the things Mercy Bend hated about her into things that sounded necessary. Ruth stood too quickly. The room tilted. She busied herself with bandages and refused to look at him until her eyes stopped burning. "You can sleep in the storeroom," she said. "Just until morning. If you die after sunrise, that is your own poor planning." Kade lowered his chin. "Obliged, Ruth Bell." No one in Mercy Bend said her name like that, as if both halves belonged together. By morning, he was gone. He left behind no note, no coins, no sentimental promise. Only a stack of split cedar outside her back door, piled higher than her waist, cut clean and even for the stove. Ruth told herself that was payment, not tenderness. She told herself many things. Spring arrived mean and muddy. Mercy Bend thawed like a carcass. The road became a brown trench. Wagon wheels sank to their hubs. Men who had strutted through winter now slipped in the muck and cursed the earth for having memory. Ruth spent her mornings scraping mud off the threshold and her evenings balancing accounts that never balanced. The roof over the storeroom leaked in two places. The back step sagged. The bank wanted its quarterly interest, $6.40, by the end of the month. The store smelled of wet wool, kerosene, and worry. Kade returned on a Thursday. Ruth heard him before she saw him, not because he was loud, but because he was heavy in a way the building recognized. One slow pressure on the porch. A pause. Another. The bell gave a sharp protest as he entered. He carried 3 cured fox pelts over one shoulder and a small wooden box under his arm. Rain darkened his hat. His beard was shorter. The line of stitches along his ribs, hidden beneath his shirt, might have been the only neat thing about him. "Your boots are a crime," Ruth said. He looked down. Mud clung to him halfway to the knee. She pointed at the boot scraper by the door. "Use it like civilization meant something." Kade took his time, scraping each sole with grave attention. A laugh rose in Ruth before she could stop it. It was a small sound, rusted. Startled by daylight, Kade looked up. The shop went very still. Ruth looked away first. "What are you trading?" "Pelts, and this." He set the wooden box on the counter. Inside were 6 jars of honey, pale gold and sealed with wax. Not the dark, bitter stuff sold by wagon men. Clear mountain honey, comb suspended inside like captured summer. Ruth stared. "That's too fine for trade." "It's not trade." Her throat tightened. "Kade." For the stitches, cedar wasn't enough. It was more than enough. Not to me. Before she could answer, the door opened hard enough to strike the wall. Mrs. Lydia Harrow swept in under a black umbrella, her bonnet pinned so tightly it seemed to have shaped her skull. The banker's sister wore lavender gloves, a pearl brooch, and the satisfied expression of a woman who had never lifted anything heavier than a teacup, and believed that made her refined. She smelled of violet water and cold judgment. "Ruth," Mrs. Harrow said, pausing when she saw Kade. Her eyes traveled from his muddy trousers to his beard to the pelts on the counter. Oh, the word did more damage than a sermon. Ruth closed the honey box. "What do you need, Mrs. Harrow?" "Pearl buttons, 6, and do wrap them. One never knows what has touched things in here." Kade did not move. He became still in the way cliffs are still. Ruth felt it. The weight of him beside the counter, not threatening, exactly, but present enough to change the air. Mrs. Harrow pinched a handkerchief to her nose. "Truly, Ruth, you must be careful. A woman in your position cannot afford more whispers. Men from the ridges carry habits and sickness, and some women invite misfortune simply by appearing grateful for attention." There it was. Not the slap. The glove laid gently over the slap. Ruth reached for the button drawer. Her face burned, scar and all. She had endured worse. She had endured it so long that endurance had become a kind of furniture in her chest. Then Kade spoke. "Ma'am." Mrs. Harrow stiffened. His voice was low enough that she had to listen. "Your perfume could scare milk sour. If you're worried what things touch, start there." The silence after it was magnificent. Ruth should have been horrified. She was. A little. But beneath the horror, something bright and wicked opened its eyes. Ruth felt the whole town pressing at the windows, though. No one was there. The bank, the church, the women with their lace collars and sharpened smiles, the men who bought on credit and then spoke of her as if she ought to be grateful for crumbs. Mrs. Harrow snapped. Ruth Bell, control this animal. Ruth looked at the woman. Then she looked at Kade's muddy boots, scraped clean as he could make them. Then she looked at her own hands, cracked from work that had fed half the town through 3 winters. No, Ruth said. The word left her before fear could catch it. Mrs. Harrow blinked. Ruth opened the button drawer and counted 6 pearl buttons onto brown paper. 20 for cents. You cannot be serious. 20 for cents. And the next time you insult a paying customer in my shop, the buttons will be 30. Mrs. Harrow snatched the parcel so hard, 1 button rolled across the counter. She threw down coins, missed one, and did not stoop to retrieve it. The door slammed behind her. The bell trembled for several seconds after she was gone. Ruth stared at the closed door. Then her knees went weak. That was foolish, she whispered. Kade leaned his forearms on the counter. Felt clean? Clean doesn't pay interest. No, but shame is expensive, she turned on him. You don't understand. You walk out of town and vanish into trees. I have to live with what follows. Kade's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. I know what it is to have people decide what you are before you speak. Ruth wanted to argue. She could not. He reached across the counter, not grabbing, not claiming, only laying his large hand over hers where it rested beside the honey box. His palm was rough and warm. You sell coffee, wick, nails, cloth, he said. Stop selling them the right to make you small. Ruth should have pulled away. She did not. Rain struck the windows behind her. The honey glowed between them, and for one dangerous minute Ruth Bell, who had built her life out of refusal, wanted to believe another kind of life was possible. The storm came 3 nights later, not rain assault. Clouds rolled down from the mountains so low they seemed to scrape the church steeple. By dusk the creek had swollen brown and fast. By midnight Mercy Bend's main street was a moving river carrying crates, chicken feathers, and someone's broken porch rail. Ruth was alone when the first shelf gave way. A crate of lamp chimneys crashed to the floor, glass bursting in every direction. The roof over the storeroom leaked in 4 places. Now each drip striking with the patience of debt. She tied up her skirt, shoved buckets beneath the worst of it, and dragged sacks of flour away from the spreading wet. Each sack weighed nearly 80 pounds. She moved them anyway. Because if the flour spoiled, there would be nothing to sell. If there was nothing to sell, the bank would get the building. If the bank got the building, Mercy Bend would say it was mercy. Thunder cracked close enough to shake dust from the rafters. Then the back door banged open. Ruth seized the shotgun from beneath the counter and turned. Kade stood in the doorway, rain pouring off his hat brim. He looked like the storm had carved him out and sent him ahead. Put that down, he said. Knock next time. Door was open. It was latched. Not well. He crossed the room, took in the water, the sacks, the broken glass, and the tremor Ruth was trying to hide in her arms. Where first? The question nearly broke her. Not what did you do? Not can you manage? Not poor Ruth. Only where first, she pointed. Flour, then the oil crates, if the water reaches the ledger chest. I am finished. They worked without ceremony. Kade lifted what Ruth could only shove. Ruth stacked what he handed her. He rolled barrels to the high wall while she swept glass into a corner with wet hair stuck to her face. The store became a battlefield of practical motion, drag, lift, brace, breathe. At one point, a beam groaned overhead. Kade looked up. That roof's giving. It has been giving for 11 years. Tonight it might take. Together, they wedged 2 planks beneath the sagging section. Ruth climbed onto the counter to lash the brace with rope, and Kade stood below with both hands lifted in case she fell. I am not a porcelain plate, she snapped. Never thought you were. Lightning flashed white through the front window. For an instant, Ruth saw them reflected there. A scarred woman in a soaked apron, a mountain man with rain in his beard, standing inside a shop the town had mistaken for her whole life. Then the window exploded. Wind drove rain and glass across the room. The force threw Ruth sideways. She struck the counter with her hip and cried out before she could swallow it. Kade moved faster than a man his size should move. He caught her around the waist and hauled her back as shards skittered across the floor where she had stood. "The ledger!" she shouted. Rain hammered the open wound of the shop. "Stay back. That book is all I have." "No." His grip tightened. "It's what they owe you, not what you are." The words hit too close. She fought him anyway. He released her only when she stopped lunging forward. Then he took the shutterboards stacked by the wall, braced himself in the storm, and began nailing them across the broken window. The hammer blows rang through the shop like gunfire. Ruth stood shaking in the half, dark, drenched to the skin, watching him take the weather straight on. Rain pasted his shirt to his shoulders. Blood appeared on one knuckle where glass had opened him. He ignored it. When the last board held, the wind dropped from a scream to a muffled roar. The store looked ruined. Water on the floor, glass in the beans, one shelf cracked. The ledger chest soaked along the bottom, but not drowned. Ruth sank onto a crate. Her whole body began to tremble. Kade came to her slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bite. "Ruth," she laughed once, without humor. "Don't say it kindly." He stopped. "Why?" "Because I will come apart." The room answered with dripping water. Kade knelt in front of her. That was the strangest thing of all. A man built like a timber wall, lowering himself to the ruined floor, so he did not tower over her. Ruth looked at his hands, mud in the nails, blood on the knuckle, a sliver of blue thread tied around one wrist, darkened by rain. "You kept it," she said. He glanced at the thread. "Used most of it. This piece held." "For what?" "My coat. A split in the shoulder. A ridiculous thing, a scrap of thread. A piece of her shop tied to the wrist of a man who belonged to the Ridges." Kade lifted his hand slowly. Ruth saw it coming and stiffened. He noticed he almost stopped. "May I?" No man had ever asked before touching the scar. Some had stared. Some had pretended not to see. One had once kissed the unburned side of her face and called it kindness. Ruth swallowed. "Why would you want to?" "Because you're hurting." The answer was too plain to defend against. She gave one small nod. His thumb brushed her jaw, careful as snowfall, crossing the tight burned skin without flinching, without worship, without pity. Just contact, warm and real. Ruth closed her eyes. "It's ugly," she said, because the old words knew their road. "No. Don't lie. I don't have the practice." She opened her eyes. Kade's face was inches from hers. Rainwater in his beard, gray eyes steady. "That scar is where the fire lost." Something inside Ruth gave way, not loudly, not like surrender, more like a locked door, finally realizing there was no house left to guard. "I am tired," she whispered. Kade said nothing. "I am so tired of proving I can survive people who think survival is all I deserve." His hand lowered to her knee, heavy and grounded. "And stop proving." "And do what?" "Choose." She looked around the store. The warped shelves, the soaked floor, the brass scale, the ledger chest. The life she had defended because no one had ever offered her another. Kade did not offer softness. He offered truth. "I have a cabin above the North Pass," he said. "Hard winters, bad soil, roof that argues with the wind. Creek freezes early. Nothing pretty, unless you count sunrise on granite." Despite herself, Ruth smiled with the unburned half of her mouth. "That is a poor advertisement. Best one I have. And what would I be there?" Kade's eyes did not leave hers. "Warm if I can help it. Hungry some days. Angry when you please. Useful because you choose to be. Mine only if you say it. Your own either way." The storm beat at the boards. Ruth looked at the blue thread around his wrist. For the first time in years, the future frightened her for a reason that felt almost like hope. Morning laid Mercy Bend bare. The storm moved east before dawn, leaving the town soaked, splintered, and shining under a hard white sky. The creek had eaten 2 footbridges and half the livery fence. Mud covered the street so completely that no wheel rut could claim it. Ruth's store smelled of wet flour and cold ashes. Kade had gone outside at first light to clear the broken boards from the back step. She could hear the steady strike of his axe splitting storm, fallen pine into pieces small enough for her stove. Ruth stood behind the counter with both hands on the ledger chest. The bottom pages were damp, but readable. Names, amounts, dates. Mercy Bend owed her $39.70. She owed the bank more. That had always been the shape of her life. Give more than she received. Smile less than they wanted. Survive and call it gratitude. The front door pushed open without the bell. It had broken in the night. Mr. Elias Harrow entered with Reverend Pike behind him. The banker wore polished boots wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the mud. Reverend Pike carried his Bible under one arm, dry as a bone. Ruth did not speak first. Harrow looked around the damaged shop and made a sorrowful sound with no sorrow in it. Miss Bell, a hard night. Ardor for those who did not sleep through it. His smile thinned indeed. My sister mentioned certain disturbances in your establishment. Now this damage. The bank must consider risk. A woman alone cannot be expected to manage repairs of this scale. Reverend Pike stepped forward. There is no shame in accepting the limits Providence sets before us. Ruth looked at him. Providence broke my window? He blinked. Harrow cleared his throat. We are prepared to offer a fair arrangement, surrender the lease before month's end, and the bank will forgive the late interest. There is a room at Mrs. Tully's boarding house. Quiet, respectable, suitable. Ruth heard the axe stop outside. The silence after it filled the room. Harrow heard it too. His eyes flicked toward the back. I see the Ridgeman is still here. Reverend Pike lowered his voice. Ruth, child, people are concerned. A woman with your history must guard her reputation. Her history, the fire, the scar, the father she could not save. The years she had kept accounts for men who would not meet her eyes, unless they owed money. Ruth opened the ledger. For one wild second she considered throwing it at him. Instead, she tore out the pages of debt one after another. The sound was sharp and beautiful. Harrow stared. Miss Bell. Ruth laid the torn pages on the counter. Tell your sister her buttons were overpriced. The Reverend's mouth opened. Ruth reached beneath the counter and pulled out the lease, folded in oilskin. She set it beside the pages. You want the building? Take it. Harrow recovered quickly. Greed was faster than dignity. That is a wise decision. No, Ruth said. It is mine. A wool skirt, 2 shirts, her father's pocket knife, a tin of coffee. The honey Kade had brought her, a coil of rope, needles, the remaining blue thread. Her hand hovered over the cracked mirror, nailed beside the washstand. For years she had looked into it each morning and let Mercy Bend tell her what she was before she had even opened the door. She left it on the wall when Ruth came back. Kade stood in the shop with the axe in one hand. Harrow and the Reverend had retreated near the door as if wilderness itself had entered and found them lacking. Kade looked at the saddlebag over Ruth's shoulder. You sure? The question held no pressure. That mattered. Ruth looked around one last time, at the counter worn smooth by her hands, at the brass scale, at the place where the wolf trap had rested, at the floorboards that had held her up when no one else bothered. This room had saved her once. Then it had slowly asked for the rest of her life as payment. I am sure, she said. Kade nodded. Outside, the town watched from behind curtains. Of course it did. Ruth stepped onto the boardwalk without lowering her head. Mud swallowed the hem of her skirt. Cold air struck her face. The burned skin tightened, as it always did. For once, she did not turn the unscarred side toward anyone. Kade's horse waited at the hitching rail, a broad-chested dun with patient eyes and enough mud on its legs to offend every clean parlor in town. Kade lifted Ruth into the saddle behind him, then mounted with easy strength. She wrapped one arm around his waist and held the saddlebag with the other. Mercy Bend had no final speech for her. Only faces in windows. Only the broken bell hanging silent above the door. They rode north. The road climbed quickly past the last fences, past the cemetery, past the church steeple that grew smaller with every switchback. The air sharpened. Chimney smoke fell away. Pine rose around them, dark and clean. By noon Ruth's thighs ached. Her hands were numb. Her stomach growled because hope did not make breakfast. Kade heard it and passed her a strip of dried venison without comment. She chewed, grimaced, and said, This tastes like salted boot, better than boiled boot. Is that experience speaking, winter of '78? She laughed. This time, the sound did not startle her. By late afternoon, they reached the cabin. It sat against a shelf of granite, built from peeled logs and stubbornness. Smoke blackened the stones above the chimney. A woodpile leaned under a tarp. Beyond it, the mountains rose blue and severe, not welcoming, not cruel, only true. Kade dismounted and reached up for her. Ruth let him lift her down. Her boots hit the ground, hard dirt. His advertisement had been honest. The wind moved through the pines with a low, lonely sound. The cabin door hung crooked. One shutter needed mending. A bucket near the creek had frozen in a ring of old ice. Kade watched her take it all in. "No lace curtains," he said. "Good. I never trusted lace. No town. Better." "No easy." Ruth adjusted the saddlebag on her shoulder. "I was not promised easy." Kade stepped close enough for warmth, but not enough to crowd. His thumb brushed the edge of her scar once, light and certain. In Mercy Bend, they had called it ruin. Here in the high cold, beneath a sky too wide for whispers, it felt like a mark on the door of a house that had survived fire. Kade turned toward the horse. "Woods behind the cabin. Water's down the cut. Supper if we earn it." Ruth looked at the crooked shutter, the woodpile, the rough ground, the impossible mountains. Then she smiled. Both sides of her face pulled unevenly. This time she let them. She set the honey on the cabin table, took up the axe. Kade had leaned by the door and stepped into the last hard light of the day. Mercy Bend would call it disgrace. Ruth called it the first honest work of her own life. And when the wind rose through the pines, it did not sound like judgment. It sounded like room.